Hi, I'm Mike Duran. I'm the director of the Center for Peace and Security in the Middle East at the Hudson Institute. And it's my honor and pleasure today to host three internationally recognized experts on Turkey to have a discussion with us about the role that Turkey is playing in the Ukraine crisis. Joining me today is Svante Cornell. He's the director of the Central Asia Caucasus Institute here in Washington, D.C. And Colonel Rich Outzen. He's a geopolitical consultant and analyst in the private sector, but he's also a former career military officer. And finally, last but not least, Sinan Ulgen. He's the director of the Center for Economics and Foreign Policy Studies in Istanbul, and he's a visiting scholar at Carnegie Europe. All three of my guests have years of experience in Turkey. Of course, Director Ulgen is himself a Turk. Rich Outzen and Svante Cornell are both fluent in Turkish, and I can't think of a panel that is going to be better placed to help us understand the complexities of this moment. Let me start with you, Sinan, if I may. Could you just, to set the stage for this discussion, could you just give us the view from Ankara? When I say the view, can you widen the aperture and talk about this not just in terms of the bilateral relations between Ankara and Kyiv, but also the wider context of Turkey's relationship with Russia, with the United States, and any other major factors that you think are significant as President Erdogan tries to decide what to do in this crisis?
Yes, Mike, thank you very much for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here. Let me try to give you, in terms of how I see the general overview or context of how things are seen from Ankara's perspective. Firstly, this crisis is a very unwanted crisis. Sitting in Ankara, you don't want to be compelled to choose between Ukraine and Russia. And the reason is Turkey has a particularly complex, often difficult relationship with Russia. But at the same time, this relationship matters to Turkey on different levels. Firstly, on the diplomatic level, Turkey has learned to work with Russia in different theaters, and particularly in Syria with the Astana process. Russia is a critical partner in trying to manage the very difficult situation in Idlib. Then there's also the experience over Nagorno-Karabakh, where Turkey and Russia ultimately work together. So Turkey does not want to undermine these other areas of diplomatic engagement with Russia by seeing to have sided firmly and exclusively with Ukraine. But the opposite is also true. Namely, Turkey has also a burgeoning relationship with Ukraine. That's been, carried by the dynamic with regard to defense industries. There's a burgeoning cooperation there. Turkey has been selling armed drones to Ukraine, and President Erdogan confirmed that Turkey would continue to do that. And therefore, Turkey values the relationship with Ukraine as well. Now, on top of that, Turkey has been, firmly on the same line as the other members of the alliance, because politically speaking, Turkey refuses to acknowledge the presence of Russia in Ukraine. It values the territorial integrity of Ukraine. It does not recognize the illegal annexation of Crimea. So on all of those counts, Turkey has been very clear in terms of its political position. So in view of all that, it's a real delicate balancing act that is required of the Turkish government. And so far, I think the diplomacy that Ankara undertook tends to confirm this. When Erdogan went to Kiev, he confirmed Turkey's support for Ukraine. He confirmed that Turkey would continue to sell armed drones. But at the same time, he appealed for a diplomatic settlement of the problem. Turkey certainly does not want any sort of military escalation because of this political context, but also because Turkey stands to be one of the countries that is likely to be most affected by such a escalation scenario. There's a lot to talk about Germany. The impact that this crisis may have on Germany, particularly through the energy channel, if the Nord Stream 2 project is suspended. But the second country that is likely to be affected most negatively was likely to be Turkey on a different number of counts. Economically, Ukraine and Russia are countries that top the list of tourists that come to Turkey. So there's the tourism angle. There's the economic angle. These are also export markets for Turkey. There's the energy angle, especially if there happens to be sanctions that would be reciprocated by a Russian blockade of energy supply. And finally, even though Turkey has been politically singing from the same tune as its NATO allies, what it has not done for reasons that I've tried to explain is to follow the sanctions policy towards Russia. So the US has sanctions, the EU has sanctions on account of the illegal annexation of Crimea, and Turkey, as discussed, has been critical of this, but it has not implemented the same sanctions as its other allies because it needs Russia on other theaters. So that sort of escalation is also unwanted because then there would be, at least that's Ankara's calculus, that there could then be increased pressure on Ankara to also apply sanctions against Russia, firstly. And secondly, also pressure to reinterpret the provisions of the Montreux Treaty of 1936 that regulates the crossing of the Turkish Straits in a way that would make also the relationship with Russia much more difficult. So it is in this context that Turkish policymakers look at the Ukraine crisis. But so far, the position has been to firmly reassert the provisions of international law. Turkey recognizes the territorial integrity of Ukraine. And even under these difficult conditions, the Turkish position has been to continue to supply armed drones to Ukraine. And that's certainly much more than we can say compared to many other NATO allies, including Germany.
Well, thank you. Svante, I'd like to turn to you right now. Let me start from the last point that Sinan made in comparing Turkey to Germany. I mean, it's really quite striking to me because here in Washington, we've been treated for a few years to a lot of rhetoric on Capitol Hill and elsewhere, even sometimes inside the government, to Turkey being a kind of Trojan horse of the Russians in NATO. And then when it comes to crisis, we see that yes, Turkey's carrying out a delicate balancing act with regard to the Russians, but it's also taking some very, very clear positions that put it on the opposite side of what I think is a very sharp divide between the West in general and Moscow. Selling drones being the most dramatic example of that. And let me just put that in a little bit of context. The Turkish drones destroyed Russian weaponry in the last year and a half, 2 years in Karabakh, in Idlib and in Libya, especially the rout of the Armenian army in Karabakh, which was carried out not exclusively but significantly by Rakhdar drones that the Azerbaijanis got from Turkey. That must make Vladimir Putin very, very uncomfortable. And when I look at this bloc that Turkey, the kind of micro alliance that Turkey has put together between with Azerbaijan, Georgia, and Turkey, I'm thinking that maybe we should think of Ukraine as part of that alliance, and to see it as a significant counterbalance to Russia. Is that the way you would read the geostrategic map?
Well, Mike, thanks for the question and thanks for the invitation to join you to talk about this. I think it's a very important subject because there have been many differences between the United States and Turkey, primarily in regards to issues further south and the previous iteration of Turkish foreign policy in the Middle East, Eastern Mediterranean. But I think what's become very clear over the past several years is two things. First, how Turkey is emerging as a counterbalance to Russia in many areas, including in the Middle East, but also that there is a big difference in how Turkey behaves, or rather, how Turkish behavior in the northern theater compared to the southern theater, if you will, and how that relates to foreign policy. Problem in Washington is very often to try to keep two things in mind at the same time. We may or may not agree with some of Turkey's foreign policy actions in the Eastern Mediterranean and the Middle East. But when we look at what's happening in the Black Sea region and the Caucasus, Eastern Europe, it's a completely different picture in terms of how that aligns with US foreign policy. And I think that's very important. Your question is whether there's a regional bloc. There might be one in the making. I'm not convinced there's one quite yet. What I think is absolutely clear is that Turkey is emerging as an independent force in regional geopolitics and in regional conflicts across, Eastern Europe and the Middle East. The interesting part is that, unlike in the past, Turkey's stance does not follow anyone else. It doesn't follow the US or Russia or Iran. Like you pointed out in your introduction, there is a tendency to view Turkey as part of something. But I think increasingly Turkey is its own power, its own force. And in some situations, its interests align with one or another of the other powers. Like I mentioned, Turkey has clashed with the US in the Eastern Mediterranean, for example, or in Syria. It clashed with Russia in both Syria, Libya, and in the Caucasus. It clashed with the Saudi Emirati bloc on Egypt and Libya, and it's clashed with Iran as well, most lately in the Caucasus. I think the big question is Turkey strong enough to build a bloc of its own? And I think that remains to be seen. We have to remember that there are very serious domestic issues that factor into how Turkey can project power. The economic situation at home, the political instability, the deep unpopularity of Erdogan right now, all of these are issues that mean that we have to take everything with a grain of salt. But I think what's begun to happen, and which I believe is almost independent of who is in power in Turkey, because we've tended to personalize, Erdogan with Turkey, and I think we shouldn't do that, but that's a different question. But what I think is going to remain, whether or not Erdogan stays in power or if there's somebody else in power in Turkey, is that there is now a Turkish-Azerbaijani alliance, which is the most salient new feature of the geopolitics of the Caucasus. You mentioned Georgia. Georgia would be a logical part of this relationship, and it, I think, could well be. The building blocks are in place. There is defense cooperation between Azerbaijan, Georgia, and Turkey. There are trilateral summits and so on. But Georgia is led by a mercurial oligarch who follows a policy, I would say, of accommodation with Russia while paying lip service to the country's Western orientation. Part of the political base for Mr. Ivanishvili's government is ethno-nationalist, which in Georgia means being skeptical to Turkic and Muslim partners. I think a more pragmatic future government in Georgia is could very well be a natural member of a Turkish-led bloc, but we're not there quite yet. Now, as for Ukraine, the same process that we've seen happening in the Caucasus seems to be going on in the Black Sea, with Turkey emerging again as the strongest counterbalance to Russia, I think, in Eastern Europe today. But I'm not sure Turkey is willing to go all in Ukraine. And I think there is a key difference between the Karabakh conflict in Ukraine. In the case of Karabakh, in spite of Russia's close relationship with Armenia, Mr. Putin and his friends were ambivalent on what to do because they recognized that Azerbaijan was the most important power in the Caucasus and did not want to alienate Azerbaijan, which meant that there was a certain level of toleration for what Azerbaijan wanted to do and did with Turkish help. This is not the case in Ukraine, which means that if you are going to totally, make a form of a bloc or alliance with Ukraine, you are going to directly challenge Russian interests. And I'm not sure that Turkey is ready to do that. I'm also not necessarily sure that anybody in Turkey would like Ukraine to be such a clear member of your bloc, because Ukraine is a difficult country to deal with in many ways. Now, if talking about a bloc, and I would end on this, is I would urge you to consider the Organization of Turkic States. This is what was Turkic cooperation has been there for many years, but it was upgraded just last year to the Organization of Turkic States, where unlike in the past, Uzbekistan is a full member, Turkmenistan is an observer member, Hungary is an observer in this cooperation as well. It's far from being a regional bloc, but it's definitely a vehicle for Turkish influence in a much broader area. And it signifies a much bigger shift, I would say, in Turkish in priorities in Turkish foreign policy. We're no longer in the period of the Middle Eastern adventures of, let's say, 2010 to 2015, which didn't turn out very well for Turkey, and where Turkey was not on the same page as the United States. If we see a Turkey that continues to put its primary emphasis on areas of the north and east, I think we have a completely new situation in terms of how Turkish and US interests align. And I think definitely the question for the United States, as the US is increasingly unwilling or unable to be directly present on its own in Central Asia and the Caucasus, is how Turkic cooperation and Turkey's role in these areas is going to play, and if that should be a priority in US policy. But I think others, maybe Mr. Hudson, could speak about that.
Thanks, Svante. I'm gonna come back to all of you about this question of the Organization of Turkic States and also the possibility of the United States aligning with it. But right now, let me move to Rich, and let me ask you if you could just give us the view from Washington. As both Sinan and Svante have pointed out that Turkey's been going its own way in the last few years, and that doesn't mean that it's with anyone else at all. It's just developing a very strong sense of its own independent interests. As the United States pulls back from the greater Middle East, however, that raises the question as to whether Turkey's independent interests in these issues can be effectively used by the United States to protect its interests. I wonder if you could give us your sense, and as I ask you this, let me just tell our viewers that you served just recently in the State Department. You've been out, I guess, for about a year, if I'm not mistaken. Right. But so you're someone I think who's extremely well versed from the inside on what the tensions are between Russia and Turkey. So can you explain to us, as President Biden is looking out from the White House at this Ukraine crisis, he sees the potential of Turkey as a counterbalance, but also some of the difficulties of working with Turkey as a counterbalance to Russia. How do you see the U.S. thinking through these issues, and how would you advise it to think through these issues?
Sure. Well, thanks, Mike, and it's great to be here with you and Sinan and Svante, a very distinguished panel, and a great mission that you're engaged in with your new center. Bottom line up front is that I am reasonably and surprisingly positive towards how Biden has handled the bilateral relationship with Turkey. I thought that starting it off with breaking that taboo on designating or in publicly speaking of the events of 1915 as a genocide in the U.S. government's term probably was not the tone setter that you would have looked for. But the funny thing is, we're in this era where both on the right and on the left in Washington, people recognize that a certain degree of retrenchment in U.S. foreign policy is necessary. I won't say we've exhausted ourselves with the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. We can throw Libya in there as well, but there's a general recognition that this post-Cold War era of a decade, better part of two, where we tried to directly re-engineer strategic balances in the Middle East, in Europe, and other places failed. And it failed at the cost of American lives and treasure. Now, that doesn't mean that we're all isolationists and small America thinkers now. There are still many who see great value in managing the alliance network and sustaining American primacy in an era of multipolarity. But I think that this is the first, well, we'll say the Trump administration in its own way as well. They've come to grips with the fact that we can't manage this all directly. So we're going to have to make some reassessments, and we're going to have to make some pragmatic decisions. And I have seen pragmatism in how the Biden administration, despite some elements within it that are very anti-Turkey and sort of reflexively so on democratic issues, on humanitarian issues in some parts of the world, on lobby or ethnic interest group based issues. There is a big anti-Turkey sentiment. Such has it always been, though. That part's not new. And my Turkish friends know, of course, that Turkey has, as you've stated, a sort of an image problem in Washington. One of my Turkish friends was doing research of the early years of the revolution that established the independent Turkish Republic at the close of World War I. And there was an interesting correspondence, I think it was Kazım Karabekir and one of the other leaders, that said, "Oh my goodness, we've just heard from Washington. God, the Congress really hates us." This was in 1920, 1921. So you know, and I think we have to take the long historical view on that. Which, and by the way, I think we're coming up from the depths that we hit maybe in 2015, 16, 17, but that still is nowhere near as bad in my view as it was in 74. In 74, Congress sanctioned Turkey over opium even before the peace operation in Cyprus. This was a time when there was popular cinema, so Midnight Express and so forth, that was explicitly anti-Turkish in the United States. It was a time when Turkish diplomats were being killed in the United States, and terrorist acts against Americans in Turkey were not unheard of as well. So let's take the long view on this. It's not as bad as it has been, but we're in a cyclical pattern. The other historical bit of context I think is important here is how Turkey views itself. A lot of Americans came to view Turkey through the lens of 80s and 90s NATO membership, and we had a very close convergence of interest. But in many ways, this was driven by Turkish weakness. And I would say over the long scope of Turkish history, the devastation wrought by the First World War and the series of wars leading up to that, the Balkan Wars and so forth, the need to reindustrialize and sort of implement Ataturk's reforms led to a period of real weakness in terms of Turkish foreign policy. It was maybe dropped from where it had been a great power as the Ottoman Empire, not even to a middle-sized power. Turkey was very much punching below its weight. It was a small power in terms of its sway over international events. Well, that's changed, clearly. Changes in the Turkish economy, demography, sort of working out some dialectics within the Turkish body politic and how secularism and piety are balanced, these sorts of things. But more than anything else, sort of economic reforms that restored Turkish economic dynamism have pushed Turkey at least back up into the league of middle-sized powers. Well, a middle-sized power does not behave like a small compliant NATO ally. So Turkey within NATO cannot be viewed in the same way that, say, a Belgium or one of the smaller countries is. Of course, it's going to have its independent foreign policy. And again, thus has it always been. So what we've seen, though, and I'm going to riff off the Organization of Turkic States comment here, is that Turkey does not want to be dominated by Russia or China or any other bloc any more than it wanted to be dominated by the United States. So what I see going on here is a cobbling together by Turkey of other powers that are threatened by external hegemons. And that could include an Azerbaijan and a Georgia, obviously a Ukraine. And it wants at all costs, in my view, and this is something I think that all sides of the political spectrum in Turkey agree with, to support the sovereignty and self-defense capabilities of other countries that might be threatened by the great power hegemons. So Turkey's role in what's been called great power competition, and I think the Pentagon's now calling it strategic competition, is as the ultimate buffer zone. And to have a strategically, we'll call it semi-non-aligned, maybe a grouping of states that don't want Russia to come in and fill spaces that frankly the United States doesn't care enough to fight over in many cases, I think is a very valuable role. And by the way, it's performing this role in Africa as well, many places where the United States is not engaging with both feet in. Turkey is engaging, and that can be sort of a hedge against Chinese hegemony and control of that area as well. So it's an interesting and a complex role. Now, it does imply a possibility for convergence. I am concerned that Washington may not see the opportunity, though, because as you know, we don't, there's different levels of looking at foreign policy. There's the unitary actor or rational actor model where everything follows a common logic and we all assess by the same criteria and then execute. That's not really how the US government works. The organizational rivalries and bureaucratic politics, and frankly, our very constitutional design that says public interest groups, ethnic lobbies being among them, have a say. They get a say through Congress. So we have this wonderful key to unlock some of the tensions with this F-16 deal that you've probably paid attention to, where the Turks have requested to purchase 40 new F-16s and to upgrade 40 additional. And this would both close a capability gap as some of their F-16s age out in the next 5 to 10 years, but also solve some of the damage done by the F-35 expulsion. It would make money for Americans and it would provide an important capability for Turks. This would be great for NATO.
Pardon me. Sorry. One second, Rich. Can I just stop you for a second and just add a little context to what you just said for some of our viewers who may not have been following this really closely. So the President Erdogan made a deal with President Putin, and he bought S-400s, an air defense system from the Russians. In response, the United States sanctioned Turkey and expelled Turkey from the F-35 program, the premier next generation fighter jet program, which was a huge blow to the Turkish arms industry. In response, then the Turks have come back and said, okay, we're out of the F-35. Let's upgrade the F-16 program. And the F-16 program, which has been the centerpiece of U.S. Turkish military cooperation, I don't know since when, but for quite a long time.
2002, roughly.
2002, and so and now there is opposition to that, and they want to throw Turkey out of the F-16 program, and that then would be, well, let me just ask you. What blow would that represent to U.S. Turkish military cooperation?
So the good news on this is that it's by no means a done deal. 50 members of Congress having signed a letter saying don't give Turkey F-16s is an expression of sort of the sense of the mood in parts of Congress. But there's really only 4 members of Congress who matter in this, because arms sales that are recommended by the executive branch really have to clear 4 hurdles. The Senate Foreign Relations Committee chairman and the ranking minority member, and then the House Foreign Affairs Committee chairman and ranking minority member, none of whom signed the letter and none of whom have come out against. However, because there has been, according to press and sort of insider rumor, a de facto embargo on any major arms sales to the Turks for several years now, it will take President Biden pushing. He will have to push on Robert Menendez, for instance, in order to get this across the transom. So the question is, will it happen? Question 1A is, will it happen? I think there's still a fair chance of it. 1B, what if it doesn't happen? Well, this is a relationship that has had its ups and downs, and we have been in a down, and we have an opportunity to get back to an up. I don't think this would drive us to a new down, so to speak, in the cycle, because the Turks are pragmatic, and they have their own 5th generation or quasi 5th generation fighter, the TFX. One of the reasons they're so close to Ukraine is because Ukraine's defense industry is very good at engines, both for UAVs and for helicopters and potentially for jets of this type. So Ukraine as a technical defense technology partner is critical to Turkey weaning off its dependence on the US for these sorts of things. Because Turkey is far less dependent now on American military hardware than it was, say, 10 or 15 years ago, it won't be a death blow to US relations if we don't sell F-16s, but it'll make us look a little silly every time we try to get Turkey to partner on anything geopolitically. Now, look, the Brits have played it differently. The Brits and several other countries in NATO have partnered very closely with Turkey. So Turkey's not going to swing virulently anti-Western, but they will certainly hedge against the United States if we continue doing these sorts of things where there is no carrot, there are only sticks.
Thanks, Rich. I don't want to get. I do want to come back to Ukraine, but all of your comments have taken us to a kind of wider view of the of the region, taking us into Central Asia, all the way from Europe through the Middle East to Central Asia. So let me just stay there for a moment, and let me put to you, Sinan, if I may, a proposition, and because I personally, putting all my cards on the table, I agree with every word that Rich said about the potential of this. I don't know if I want to call it a Turkic bloc, because this is such a far-flung geographic area. The area represented by the Organization of Turkic States. They have vastly different interests. They're not really all. They're not at all connected in hard power terms and so on. But clearly, they do all share, as Rich said, a desire to be independent of the Russians and the Chinese, and are working together in that context. And I think Svante mentioned as well that Hungary is a member of the an observer member of the organization. It strikes me, as Rich said, that if you're looking at this from the American point of view, and you start from the premise that the United States, whether we have a Democrat in power or a Republican, the United States is going to be pulling back from this region. The way my mind works is I say, okay, our number one goal is that Russia and China don't become hegemons in Eurasia, and that there isn't a Russia-Chinese alliance that dominates Eurasia. And then I say, there should be a network of states that are working to assure that that doesn't happen. How could we possibly put something like that together? Well, it's being put together without us. And so here's my proposition, Sinan, and I'd love to get your reaction to it. It's that you describe this delicate balancing act. And the critics of Turkey in Washington look at that balancing act, and they look at all of the elements of cooperation with the Russians in it, and they say, see, Turkey's not an ally. And they ignore the other elements, like the sale of drones to Ukraine at this particular moment. When I look at that, I say something else. If the United States would align its own interests and its own strategic worldview more closely with Turkey, we would get much more out of Turkey on the plus side than we are currently. So the more critical we are, the farther we pull back, the more we are actually incentivizing Turkey to hedge in the opposite direction. Do you agree with that? Or do you think I'm missing something? I'd just love to get your reactions to all that you've heard here about this.
Yes. Well, thank you for the opportunity to address this question, because very few people actually present such an opportunity for a more constructive Turkey-US relationship. And I think this is exactly the right approach, because indeed we do have a number of problems bilaterally, and there is certainly a need to rebuild some of the trust. Both sides have, justified grievances with regard to each other. And just looking at those bilateral problems, sometimes you need to be creative about how you want to approach things. And this angle of trying to look at how Turkey and the US can indeed cooperate in geographies where Turkey has a significant value added is the right way forward in my mind, because that's exactly the type of construct that would help the agendas of both countries, the US and Turkey, as they look at this, reshaped global dynamic, at the strategic competition. And one indeed particular area where already the Turkish involvement has made a significant leap is Central Asia, for understandable reasons. The Organization of Turkic States and how you build something more permanent and something more effective around that idea. But the other geography where I think a lot more can be done is Africa. Because as we look around the world where the strategic competition takes place, there are areas where, you know, the U.S. is obviously as the dominant actor in world politics has a primary role. There are areas of this world where, you know, Turkish involvement matters little because it's either far off, it's geographically distant, and so on. So the issue is, where do we find the areas where the Turkey-US cooperation can indeed be, in very concrete terms, yield outcomes that are beneficial for both parties? The Middle East has been a problematic area, as we have seen in recent memory. But the Central Asia and Africa, I think, are the two theaters where much remains to be done, and a lot remains to be explored about how we can build up this bilateral relationship in a way that makes, you know, Turkey a more influential player there. Just to perhaps back this statement, in Central Asia, there is a generational divide. The generational divide is, you know, the older generation that grew up, you know, under the Soviet rule, have still, you know, some attachment to those, if you want, to that sort of conditions. The new generation, on the other hand, have a very, and for lack of a better word, you know, have a very clear Western vocation. They want to live like, their youth group in the West. They watch all the same things. They listen to similar music. They want those type of freedoms. And the only country in this respect that can help to some degree the transformation of all of those states in this direction is Turkey. Because when you look at all the other countries that are part of this group, they come from a similar, political background. It's Turkey that, as an ally of NATO, a secular democratic country with free market economy, with a growing economic might, can actually play a transformative role. But obviously, Turkey's own resources are also quite limited, and more so recently with the economic duress that we are, experiencing. But nonetheless, over the medium and long term, this is the area where a Turkey-US alliance could indeed make a significant impact. It's just a matter about, of being more creative about what we want to do together and having the bandwidth, frankly, to talk about these issues. And here, I would fully agree with you that Central Asia and that Africa are the two regions where this discussion needs to take place between our policymakers.
I think, Rich, did you want to get, sorry, Rich, did you want to get in on this?
Just one quick comment. I want to fully associate myself with Sinan's observations, but I also wanted to add one little bit of context here is that I think the Biden administration came to the same conclusion that Sinan has in about August, September, October timeframe, as Afghanistan was reaching the sort of crescendo of the debacle, and as we started to notice that Ukraine was becoming a problem. There was, as a result of one of the conversations between the two presidents, something called a joint mechanism that was discussed, that was supposed to be a way forward to do exactly what Sinan was calling for, which was for both sides to look globally at different areas where we can cooperate and collaborate instead of waiting for the crisis in country X or country Y to come about. There were one or two initial meetings and then nothing. So I think and to be fair, we have a new ambassador who's just started in Ankara, and there's some other bandwidth problems, I think, as Sinan put it, that keep the administration's focus on something else. But there has been a consistent appetite, especially from the Turkish side, for structured conversations to find these areas for cooperation, because there's clearly overlap in a lot of areas. Instead of having just the crisis points absorb all the bandwidth, we should have a systematic talk about where we can build progress and traction in the bilateral relationship. And I hate to say, Washington has not upheld its part of the bargain in terms of making this joint mechanism work.
My impression is that my impression is that the United States has yet to settle on a kind of strategic concept for this new era of great power competition. By which I mean, there are a lot of people, a lot of influential people in Washington who are saying we just have to move all of our resources to East Asia because that's where the real action is. Without I think the recognition is going to come, and maybe it's coming right now before our eyes in Ukraine. But I think it's going to come that this competition with China is global, and I also think that the recognition is going to come that Russia is in an alignment, certainly, but I would even go further, say alliance with China. But Svante, let me get you in on this in this conversation. What do you see as the potential and the impediments for U.S. Turkish cooperation on a larger field?
Well, I think the discussion so far has made it clear that there is huge potential and there are opportunities coming out from the both from the what's happening in the world simply, but also from the fact that we are gradually putting some distance to the situation about 5 years ago, when there was a very unlucky confluence of events, if you will. On the one hand, the situation in Syria, where the United States ended up supporting an affiliate of an organization that we ourselves classify as a terrorist organization, which is the Kurdish militias that are under the control of the PKK. And the other, I would think, in many ways, excuse me, even more unfortunate situation of the unsuccessful coup against Erdogan, that by all accounts was masterminded by a wayward imam sitting in the United States in Pennsylvania, Fethullah Gulen. I think those two things, if one of them had happened, that would have been bad enough. Both of these things happening at the same time is what really sent the relationship into a tailspin in ways I think that are not understood in Washington, how this was perceived in Turkey. So I just want to say that the more we get away from that situation and can rebuild the relationship, the opportunities are going to be bigger, as long as we don't make similar mistakes. That said, I think there are the two major problems, I would say, one on the American side, one on the Turkish side. On the American side is a complete lack of strategic thinking in Washington and the inability of the Biden administration, or for that matter, the Trump administration, to see how Turkey fits into the broader geopolitical interests of the United States, whether in Europe, whether in the Middle East, whether with regard to Russia and China. I think that absolutely has to change. On the Turkish side, I think, to put it very simply, the mouth of President Erdogan can be the biggest problem, because even though, without even getting into a discussion, maybe we have to get into a discussion of how Turkish foreign policy is made, because I think it's much more complicated than just assuming that President Erdogan decides everything by himself. I don't at all believe that that's how it happens. But the fact is that Turkey does one thing and President Erdogan sometimes says another thing. And very frequently he resorts to Islamist type of language, anti-American type of language that, you know, in one's quick shot can undermine weeks or months of bureaucratic and think tank and other work in order to build up, you know, the opportunities in the relationship. And frankly, I don't know that there is a solution to that problem. So the likes of us, people who matter more than us within the governments of the two countries, can do work to convince the US to think more strategically. And then, you know, President Erdogan can go off and mouth off about something, and suddenly all that work will have been ruined. And I think that is the knowledge that is a danger, is an impediment to people who are working in this direction within both governments of Turkey and the United States, because we're not sure if the work we're going to do, if we're going to end up with egg on our faces simply. I think that's the way a lot of people think. But I think the most important thing is to begin in Washington and not to stop putting an equal sign between Turkey and President Erdogan. They are not one and the same thing. There are national interests in Turkey that are being developed by a policy process that involves the military, that involves part of the state bureaucracy, and of course, on top of which sits President Erdogan. But I think there are things that are happening in Turkey, particularly the outreach or the policy in Central Asia, the Caucasus, the Black Sea region, that are not going to necessarily change very much independent on who is in power in Turkey. And we have to deal and work with these other forces in Turkey that are influential in the policymaking process, as opaque as it might seem to us, and not just constantly focus our energies on President Erdogan himself.
Rich, do you have a kind of short list of the items that you would like to see the United States to address in the near term? Not the big strategic questions, but the short list of things that we could do that are doable, that could result in the kind of strategic conversation that I think all of us here would like to see.
Yes, well, obviously, in a perfect world, there would be some progress or resolution on Turkey's main gripes or qualms over the last 5 to 10 years. I don't think the politics in the U.S. will allow that to happen. And I'm talking about the complaints about the Gulen organization and their role that I think is not widely disputed in serious academic circles about the coup attempt and about support to the YPG. We seem to have settled into sort of an agreement to disagree on those things, and I don't think that those are going to be the resolution. The resolution of those are not going to be what leads to a newer and better equilibrium. The short list for me of things that would get us to a newer and better equilibrium, the first would be engagement by President Biden personally with the 4 key committee members that we talked about before to get the F-16s moving, because the F-16s are a tangible statement of cooperation and affiliation. It restores some momentum in U.S. Turkish defense industrial ties. It remedies a real shortfall in Turkish air power until the TFX comes online, and it makes money for Turks and Americans. So I don't think there's a bad aspect to that deal, and that would be a powerful symbol. The second would be energetically pursuing this, if you want to call it a joint mechanism, but some sort of a globally focused conversation about where we can do things together. Because the truth is, the further you get away, I've always felt that there's an inverse relationship between proximity to Turkey geographically and the Turkish risk tolerance and our ability to cooperate with one another. The further we get away from Turkey's borders, the more Turkey is willing to accept the U.S. role, and the more our roles are complementary. We have big problems that stem primarily from 2 countries. That's Iraq and Syria, and because of the way that both of those have gone down in the last 10 to 15 years. And by the way, we worked through most of the Iraq problems. So actually, the United States and Turkey now are both firmly invested in the survival of the Kurdistan regional government. We have business ties. Our companies work through there, sometimes together, when we're both trying to push back on Iranian hegemony over Baghdad. Syria may approach that at some point. It's going to have to come at a time when we've stopped arming the YPG for obvious reasons. But the further you get away from those areas, the more good that we can do together. And I think that's always been the case. The hope had been Afghanistan was going to be sort of the resuscitator, right? That was going to be the place where, as we draw down, the Turks stand up, become the power that helps operate, represents NATO and operates. But that's done. That's done because of the way the whole thing collapsed when we stepped away. Ukraine's a possibility, but there are others. And I think Svante and Sinan have both referenced Africa as a place where we could do that. So you got to have the mechanism. So the State Department needs to find the bandwidth, as does with the White House and NSC backing, to throw themselves into finding some cooperative projects there. Libya is a place where, for example, in Africa, the United States and Turkey have actually been working in complementary manners, not always together, but rolling back the assault on Tripoli and reigniting the UN-led talks. Those were both the product of work that the United States and Turkey put in. And especially now that we have rapprochement, this will be the 3rd one on the list, sort of blooming. And Turkey is sort of assiduously pursuing a rapprochement with 3 of its bêtes noires from the last 5 years, with the Emirates, with Saudi, with Israel, and the rapprochement with Egypt, I think, will be in the cards at some point as well. The United States needs to do everything it can to strengthen that and to encourage and to incentivize it. Because in addition to this sort of semi-non-aligned bloc of countries in the middle we've talked about, we have to just get our own house in order in terms of friends of the United States, countries that aren't exactly non-aligned, but they are friends of the United States. The last 5 years, we've had them at each other's throats, and that's not been propitious for anyone. So a little bit of statesmanship to foster and accelerate what they're already doing with themselves would be a great thing to do.
That's great
Mike,
advice.
can I add, very briefly, two thoughts on this, very valuable comments by Rich?
Sure.
I think, answering the question that you posed them, but not to me, I've taken the liberty to, to pitch in with two general remarks. One is, in the aftermath of the Ukraine crisis, if this crisis is going to be solved by diplomatic means, that means that the overlap between Russian demands and the NATO position, as disclosed in the NATO paper that was sent to Moscow, is actually the renegotiation over the security regime in Europe that would involve transparency measures, a new, arms, a new disarmament process, and monitoring. And I think there is a lot of scope for the, for the strengthening of mutual trust between particularly US and Turkey. Because what Turkey fears is that this project, the US will let the EU and particularly France run with this project. And that would be very detrimental to how Turkey sees its own security. So there, the fact that the US makes the extra effort to incorporate Turkey in these discussions, to value Turkey's input, and to not make this a purely EU-driven, security negotiation with Russia, would be very important. I think this is perhaps, the time to highlight this, given, the crisis in Ukraine. And the second dimension, of course, Syria. Syria will matter a lot. And there, if there is a political settlement, then the way that Turkey and the US could work together, not only to stabilize Syria, but also in the reconstruction phase. And that's, very important, because that's the only way, in my mind, that would create the conditions for a safe and secure return of the large number of Syrian refugees in Turkey to Syria. There needs to be a lever there, and the lever is reconstruction. And we all know that if there is going to be the reconstruction of Syria, that's not going to be funded by Iranians or the Russians. It's going to be the West. And I think they're trying to link, to the degree that's possible, reconstruction efforts to the guarantees by the regime that these refugees can return, can be, relocated to their home places, will be very important. And that's another angle where I think the Turkey-US relationship can make a huge impact.
Well, thank you for that. Listen, I want to end here in one last round of questions. We're already at about an hour mark, so let's see if we can do this really quickly. But I want to take it back. We went, to these larger strategic questions that I wasn't expecting to hit so much. Let's take it back to Ukraine, and let me, Sinan, let me let me start with where you left off. But let me put another picture in front of you, an alternative picture, and get your response to it. You premised your comments on the notion that we'll have a diplomatic solution to Ukraine. I think there's a lot of signs are, I would guess that in Las Vegas, the odds are we're going to see a Russian invasion very soon. And I think most, if not all, military analysts who are looking at this assume that it's going to be a Russian victory. The only question is the extent of the victory and what the Russian aims are going to be. But let me give you a worst case, not exactly worst case scenario, but a very bleak scenario, and that is that the Russians move in and they take the entire they take the entire coast of the Black Sea all the way down to Odessa, And we find ourselves then with Russians up against now, Russian troops right up against Romania. And as a result of this, the Black Sea, the Russian position in the Black Sea becomes that much stronger. The Russian capacity for bullying Georgia becomes that much stronger. The Russian position in Syria becomes that much stronger because of the direct connection, the military connection. It's an umbilical cord running from Crimea down to Latakia. And then if you're sitting in Ankara, you've got Russian forces in Armenia, you've got empowered Russian forces just to your north in Ukraine and the Black Sea. You've got Russian forces in Syria. Does that create a context in which Turkish-U.S. relations become stronger, or does that create a context in which President Erdogan moves closer to Putin?
It would definitely create a context in which Turkey-NATO relations would become stronger, and by extension, Turkey-US relations. The way that you've described, quite actually, as we speak, a plausible scenario, unfortunately, would be a security nightmare for Turkey. Now, perhaps today, Turkey does not perceive, a direct threat from Russia. But obviously, when you make your threat assessment, capabilities is one big part of that threat assessment. So the more Russia enhances its offensive capabilities that could target Turkey, the more concerned Turkey shall be. Because intent, which is the second parameter of that calculus, may not be there today, but once the capabilities are there, you can never have a guarantee that intent will not change. And therefore, for the security policy establishment, for the foreign policy establishment of Turkey, that would be a very undesirable outcome, and Turkey would further value its presence within NATO and by extension its relationship with the US. Now, that does not mean necessarily that Turkey will move every bit in the direction that the US wants in terms of containment of Russia, because of the very complex relationship that Ankara has with Moscow. And it's the tyranny of geography, in other words, that Turkey cannot act the same way. It has other considerations than countries that are not neighbors of Russia.
Svante, do you have anything to add to that scenario?
Well, I do, because I think smarter people than me disagree on whether Russia plans to invade or not. I think there's still a good chance that Mr. Putin is more interested in splitting the Western alliance and is going to be a winner in any case, whether he invades or not. I also think that irrespective of what he wants, the situation is now so tense that a war can emerge by mistake. The problem is that the Russians have gotten Ukraine wrong at practically every step of this conflict since 2014. Because they don't think Ukraine is a real country, they didn't expect Ukrainians to defend themselves against Russia. And I think if they decide to go very far into Ukraine, they're going to face a very difficult situation and get bogged down there. The Russians have been gloating at how the US got bogged down in Afghanistan and Iraq in the past couple of decades. Well, let's see what happens if they try to control the whole of Ukraine or even a big chunk of it. I think that could end up creating completely new geopolitical dynamics that might not at all be in Russia's long-term interest, that might create a situation in which, we spoke about how Azerbaijan has taken a stand on Russian issues in Ukraine that is fairly unprecedented in terms of supporting Ukraine's territorial integrity and launching itself as an alternative in terms of natural gas production for Europe, for example, which of course it's wanted to do for a long time. But I think many other countries are going to react to what the Russians are doing in ways that we might not expect. I am not at all sure that everybody would see Russia as an extremely powerful country. A lot of people further east see Russia as a declining power that is trying to cling on to whatever influence it has in its so-called near abroad. And I think if this does not go well for Russia,
sorry to interrupt. When you say further east, you're talking about
I'm talking about
Kazakhstan,
Central Asia, for
Uzbekistan.
example.
Yeah.
I mean, I think a lot of states will react in ways that will, get them to find ways to oppose Russian influence in their region and in their territory. So it could create completely new processes, new relationships, new alliances that are only embryonic in stage today.
Thanks, Svante. Rich, you want to take us home here? Do you
Sure.
have any reactions to what you've heard?
It's always great to be able to follow such distinguished and insightful commentators, because then I can just add a little quip to it and look as smart. Look, the bottom line is I agree with those who say that Russia's playing a fairly weak and declining hand very well. They are playing it aggressively. Now, the problem, and I don't think they'll go in all the way to Odessa. I don't think they'll go all the way to Kyiv, because I think the further they go in, the longer those lines of supply get, the more they are liable to have a lot of body bags going back to Mother Russia, and that's not in anybody's interests, not even Putin's. I think there's already been a galvanizing effect within NATO, which is encouraging to an extent. I think people now realize that hard power conflict is once again a possibility here. I think if he actuates this all the way with a big war, then it's going to be a paradigm shift, even more so. And that again will rob Putin of the ability to do what he's done so successfully with Germany and with Turkey and with others, which is to say, look, I have modest and very reasonable goals, and I want to make money. We can do that together. I want to exert a little influence on it. But if it goes from that to a full-out hegemonic power trying to gobble up a country that is seen as a legitimate and sovereign state by most of the world, he will have misplayed that hand, and that's not the Putin that we've observed before. Now, Mariupol, trying to link the Crimea to Donetsk and Luhansk, that seems credible. You'd find a lot of Germans probably who would say, well, yeah, kinda, I can see why he did that. And that would be more in the Putin playbook, I think, doing a little bit. The problem with that is that once you start doing that a little bit, then it becomes accepted both by your competitors and by your own people that's the normal rule of the game. I had a friend, a Japanese geopolitical thinker once, who said, look, of course we're very strong against China, so because we have much to fear from Chinese hegemony in this region. But if we see that the United States fails to stand up to China, and that there is no structure off which to balance, guess what? We're going to be making deals with China. That's from the Japanese. So I think the same goes, there's a lot of people watching this, including Turkey and other states of NATO, including Romania and Bulgaria and others, probably never the Poles, will be put in a position of saying, well, look, if this is the bully and he's not gulping, but he's nibbling, we're going to have to make a deal with him. And I don't think that's a Europe that we want to see. So, yeah, I don't see the big invasion, but I think he'll try something small. He kind of has dealt this hand in such a way that he has to do something. And I think it's important for us to be resolute in trying to drive up his costs in doing so. And I very much hope that we support Ukraine through means, open and covert, economically and material, to do everything we can to raise costs if he actually does this thing. And I think the Turks might be open to working with us in that regard.
So even if Rich, just to follow on what you're saying, even if he goes, so Sinan said, if he goes in for the major operation and the attempt to take over all the coastline down to Odessa, that's going to push the U.S. and Turkey together one way or another. But you're saying even if he goes for just for half a loaf, goes for Mariupol and to complete the land bridge to Crimea, that as well will push the U.S. and Turkey together. I wasn't quite sure because
I'm saying that
it could go either way.
Whether it does or not will depend on the quality of U.S. statesmanship. And I will tell you, if they do that, we need to raise costs, and we need to make a good deal with Turkey to make sure that they help as much as they can in raising those costs. Because Mariupol, if allowed to stand, will be the death knell later for Kyiv and for Odessa. So
Okay.
that's
So if
what I'm
the-
saying.
So if the United States gets serious and works with Turkey to try to as a counterbalance consciously, it can work to the advantage of the U.S. Turkish relationship. But if the West is feckless as it has been in the past, then that will encourage Turkey to go toward Russia.
Pragmatic deals. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Well, listen. If I think we've had a very rich and informative discussion, and I think I'll bring it to an end unless somebody has a major comment that they'd like to make here. Nope. Okay. Speak now or forever hold your peace. Listen. Let me thank all of you. This was one of the best discussions that absolutely the best discussion on Turkish-U.S. relations that I have heard in a very long time. And I really have a deep debt of gratitude to the three of you. Thanks very much. And I hope to see you back soon.
Thank you.
Thank you.